Sometimes an old thing can become very valuable. When old items are repaired, they can be much better than new ones. Sometimes these items can even be returned to their owner. According to a tradition in Russia, very old products are returned to their owners after they have been repaired. Ukrainian engineers are making sure that this tradition continues. You can subscribe to us to be informed about the latest developments on the war. You can also use the Super Thanks button at the bottom of the video to continue our independent reporting. Let's start if you're ready. When Russia decided to invade Ukraine, the Russian army had a very important first: its tanks. The Russian army claimed to have the most powerful tanks in the world. Using these tanks, Russian soldiers started to advance on the borders of Ukraine, but these soldiers did not know what they were about to experience. As you know, the Russian army was forced to withdraw from the occupied towns in a short period of time. But this retreat was very costly because Russian soldiers left their tanks on many fronts and started running. The footage of Russian soldiers running away made Putin very angry. These images were causing the Russian army to be disgraced all over the world. But these images had another meaning. As the Russian army fled Ukraine, it abandoned many ammunition depots. Russian soldiers, especially those who wanted to escape, quickly planned to leave the tanks in the area and continue the war. But this plan did not work. The Ukrainian army confiscated tanks from all the areas where the Russian troops retreated. These tanks were the most powerful parts of the Russian army. Each tank lost by the Russian army changed the balance of the war even more. After the Ukrainian army started capturing Russian tanks, they came up with a plan. Commanders mapped the entire war zone using drones. All ammunition depots where Russian army tanks were located were marked one by one. The Ukrainian army began to operate on these depots. Snipers and infantry took part in this operation supported by drones. First, Russian soldiers on the watchtower were killed by Ukrainian snipers. Then Ukrainian infantrymen entered the warehouse and started killing Russian soldiers on guard duty one by one. After the Ukrainian army established control over the Russian warehouses, the tanks were immediately removed from the warehouse. During the delivery of these tanks, drone cameras located Russian soldiers in the area. Thus, the Russian tanks were safely removed from this area. The Ukrainian army seized tanks from Russian military depots. This move by the Ukrainian army caused a serious reduction in Russia's tank stockpile. But Ukraine's real plan was different. Ukrainian soldiers have another plan for Russian tanks. This plan was unknown to anyone for a long time. But today's developments have revealed that the Ukrainian army has been practicing this plan for a long time. It was the Ukrainian army's drones that caused the most damage to Russian army tanks. The Ukrainian army decided to use Bayraktar drones to destroy Russian tanks. These drones dropped their bombs on the Russian tanks. Russian tanks were rendered useless after a single drone bombed. Russian soldiers would abandon these tanks and run away. There was one thing the Ukrainian drones were careful about during these operations. The drones were targeting only the barrels of the Russian tanks. The barrels of the Russian tanks were damaged in the explosion so that they could no longer fire. But why were Ukrainian soldiers specifically targeting the barrels of these tanks? How did this tactic affect the course of the war? Engineers know the answer to this question. Expert engineers in the Ukrainian army are modernizing captured Russian tanks. The barrels of the tanks in the Russian army are quite old. Ukrainian engineers are replacing these barrels and making them more long-range. Damage to the barrels of Russian tanks was also planned by Ukrainian engineers. The engineers said that these barrels would be replaced anyways. Damage to the barrels was therefore not a problem for Ukrainian engineers. It even made it easier to dismantle the barrels. But the Ukrainian engineers had a very difficult task because targeting only the barrel of a tank is a very difficult task for any soldier. But Ukrainian soldiers had to fulfill this difficult task because the Ukrainian army was in a very disadvantaged situation in terms of ammunition. In order to win this war, the Ukrainian army had to confiscate Russian tanks, so the soldiers accepted the challenge. However, They soon realized that this was actually not a very difficult task because drones have a very precise aiming capability. Bayraktar drones have a very high hit rate. When the Ukrainian soldiers carefully planned and ordered by Roger to fire, the barrels of the Russian tanks were shattered into pieces. This success of the drones led to the Russian tanks changing hands more easily. The Ukrainian army and engineers worked together to carry out this plan over a long period of time. In this way, a large number of Russian tanks were captured. More than 500 tanks were reportedly captured, ranging from Cold War-era T-62s to Russia's latest 90 models. The Russian army lost millions of dollars. The Ukrainian army got very expensive tanks for almost nothing. But these tanks was still not enough for the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army needs more tanks. Ukrainian President Zelensky has been fighting for this for a long time. Zelensky has asked for tank support from many states through diplomatic negotiations. He convinced all states to send German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The first shipments of these modern tanks to Ukraine have started. In addition to the Leopard 2 tanks, other tanks are expected to join the Ukrainian army. American Abrams, M1s, and British Challengers 2s are also being sent to this war for Ukrainian independence. It is said that when these new tanks arrive to the Ukrainian army, the course of the war will change completely. The Ukrainian army has largely repelled the Russian invasion. However, a comprehensive ground operation is needed to liberate all regions in order to start this operation. The Ukrainian army needs modern tanks on all fronts. The tanks sent by Western countries are crucial for the Ukrainian army to carry out a comprehensive ground operation. This operation could end the war. Russia does not have the power to resist these tanks. What do you think about the Ukrainian army capturing Russian tanks? Do you think it makes sense for these tanks to be modernized by the Ukrainian army? What do you think about the plan of Ukrainian engineers? How will the tanks that Western countries will send to Ukraine affect the outcome of this war? Wars have never been won by physical force. It is necessary to break the willpower of the opponent or the enemy, which is important in an encounter or conflict, and it's necessary to collapse it mentally. Unless this is achieved, you will not be victorious, and unless you give up, you will not be defeated. Ukrainians know this very well and manage to get out of hell pits with willpower. On the other hand, it is very difficult to say the same for Russians. While the Ukrainians are fighting for a noble cause, the Russians are sent aimlessly to the front as cannon fodder. This difference is more than enough for Ukraine to run to victory as the most concrete result of this willpower of Ukraine. Although the Bakhmut front opened to the gates of hell, the Ukrainians were able to cope with it. On the other hand, the thought of the Russian soldiers is to fulfill their duties and, if possible, to escape from the front. However, this doesn't happen, and tens of thousands of Russians on the Bakhmut front are stuck aimlessly in the middle of hell. A city of 41 kilometers offers a clash arena to nearly 200,000 soldiers. This is the city of Bakhmut, the most critical front of the war between Ukraine and Russia in the steppes of Eastern Europe. If you've ever thought about how many soldiers were killed in this city or how many were now fighting in the trenches in and around Bakhmut, then yes, you realize that this war is the most violent phenomenon that has affected Europe since World War II. It remains unclear exactly how many soldiers and civilians have been killed or injured in the city of Bakhmut to date, but the estimated numbers are quite tragic and horrific. It's estimated that a total of 190,000 people were killed or injured in the city of Bakhmut alone from February 24, 2022, when the clashes began. Despite all these heavy losses, clashes in the city still continue fiercely. Most recently, the Ukrainians made serious efforts to seize control of the Kromov highway northwest of Bakhmut. As a result of the clashes that took place a few days ago as a result of the heavy bombardment of the Ukrainian artillery brigade stationed near the highway, the Ukrainian armed forces began to hold the control of the Kromov highway to a large extent at the moment. But there is still a Russian threat in the region. On the other hand, the southwestern parts of Bakhmut are still quite active. Successful operations by the Ukrainian armed forces in the southwest of the city on the sides of Ivanivka woodlands and the crossover highway link road have yielded positive results in the last few days. In addition, the Ukrainians continuing their military preparations from the direction of Opitin in the south of Bakhmut and from Yagodny in the north have completely squeezed Bakhmut, which is described as the fortress of the war from 4 places. Yes, the Russians have also put into action their retaliation plans against the situation, but Ukraine seems to be in the foreground, both in terms of location advantage and numerical superiority. To understand this situation more clearly, we need to dig deep into the Bakhmut front line. The fiercest clashes are taking place in the city's central trenches and the borders of Bakhmut, currently occupied by highway areas within the borders of Bakhmut. 80,000 Russian soldiers are now helplessly in the middle of hell. They are completely helplessly trapped in the trenches as cannon fodder. At this point, we're faced with the most interesting part of the work because the military logistics to Bakhmut, where fierce trench warfare still continues, is most easily provided from the highways located in the northwest and southwest directions of the city. So the fact that so many Russian soldiers are now stuck in the Bakhmut swamp will perhaps decide the fate of the war. Bakhmut is one of the front lines that will determine this fate. On the other hand, these connecting roads are largely under the control of Ukrainians. But in the next few days it is possible that we can see the offensive actions of the mercenaries of the Wagner Group, especially on these connecting roads. The reason for this is that Russia does not have an effective area to even act in Bakhmut. Therefore, the Moscow administration will want to give the Russian army a sigh of relief by sending Wagner forces to the side of the connection roads around Bakhmut. But this situation is quite risky for the Russians because in the aforementioned areas, artillery units, special forces and snipers of the Ukrainian armed forces are constantly on the alert. Unplanned realization of the idea of seizing the connection roads leading to Bakhmut by Russia or Wagner forces may cause difficult situations to come back. The reason for such a high-risk factor is that the Ukrainian army constantly receives military and financial support from the USA and Western Europe. On the other hand, the loss of approximately 3,500 battle tanks by the Russian army is one of the factors determining the direction of the clashes in Bakhmut. Because the Russian army has lost so many tanks, it's not effective enough against the Ukrainians in the trench battles in Bakhmut. According to this data, if we need to make a simple calculation, the Russian army has lost about 88 tank battalions on the territory of Ukraine since the beginning of the war. It's estimated that more than half of these tank losses occurred in the city of Bakhmut. Have you ever thought about the reasons why Russia lost so many tanks since the Second World War? The Russians have prepared many general situation reports on how to increase their defense industry by making cost calculations. In line with these reports, Russia began to thin the armor of the war tanks they produced. Since Russia does not value its own people and soldiers, the designs of the war tanks they produce are based on principles such as cheap and easy production. In addition, there is a very thin armor structure on the bottom layer which corresponds to the driver pedals of the Russian tanks. Even the RPG-7 hitting this area can destroy the tank if slightly more powerful systems are available. Effective shots can be made on the shield part of the tank around the driver optics. Also, as soon as you close the sight of the driver of Russian tanks, you can render the tank completely useless. In fact, the loss of soldiers in the Russian army is reaching record numbers due to critical reasons such as the easy destruction of Russian tanks on Ukrainian soil. In other words, the cheap and unstable war equipment cost the lives of Russian soldiers. The most impartial and most up-to-date assessments on this issue came from the United Kingdom, the superpower of Western Europe, and the United States, one of the biggest allies of Ukraine. From the Ukraine war to date, the Russian army and the private military company Wagner Group have killed and injured a total of more than 220,000 soldiers, according to the latest assessment by the UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and the US intelligence community. Considering these striking numbers, there are some really important and deep systemic problems in the efforts of the Russian forces at the moment. This latest casualty is 20,000 higher than the previous Western assessment published in February. Indeed, since November, an average of more than 18,500 Russian casualties of dead and wounded soldiers nearly every month, more deadly than in the previous month. In other words, the current Russian losses are more than the occupation force that attacked Ukraine on February 24, 2022. This alone is the clearest proof that Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation against his little neighbor has so far failed spectacularly. On the other hand, until recently, Western casualty estimates tended to be more conservative than Ukraine's claims. Indeed, the West estimates that Russian forces have lost about 1,900 main battle tanks, but the Ukrainians argue that Russian forces have lost about 2 times as many battle tanks to date. Much more confusing, then, is the discrepancy in the number of killed and injured. Ukrainians use the word liquidated to refer to Russian losses. However, this choice of words symbolizes the actual dead and wounded figure. Judging from Ukraine's claims in other categories of Russian losses, such as main battle tanks, we can reasonably consider that the Ukrainians, when using the term liquidated, means killed, because this method of assessment means that Ukrainians do not take into account the wounded Russians. Standard military wisdom indicates that for 1 dead there are 2 or 3 wounded. Therefore, adding the wounded into the Russian army brings the total estimate of Russian losses to 680,000 dead and wounded, which would be in line with the estimates of material losses. In summary, as long as this war, which has deeply affected Eastern Europe, continues, we will be able to see almost double or much more of these numbers, especially in the Bakhmut front line and in other trenches in Ukraine, because the weather will warm up in a very short time and clashes will increase considerably. The Russians conducted yet another missile strike, although this time it was not as massive. In total, the Russians launched 16 cruise missiles and 5 kamikaze drones. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that 9 rockets and 2 drones were shot down. Nonetheless, the Russians are still inflicting severe damage to the Ukrainian energy facilities. Ukrainian officials are not sugarcoating the situation and say that the damage reaches a critical point where the integrated energy system may collapse in separate units. Right now, around 40% of people are with no electricity in many instances. This also means that there is no heating, which creates an extremely dire situation. As in many regions, we can already see the first snow, but for some people, no heating is the last thing on their minds because as a result of the missile strike, many civilians had been killed and wounded. Today in the Zaporizhia region, rockets struck several residential buildings. The buildings got completely demolished and several families died under debris. The Zaporizhia region seems to have also become an active part of the front line because today President Advisor Aristovich said in an interview that the Russians conducted their first attack here. These attacks were directed towards Mariupol. The ultimate goal here would be to reach Pavlograd, which right now is 100 kilometers behind the front line. Pavlograd is one of the most important logistic hubs in eastern Ukraine because it allows supplying the Donbass and Luhansk groups fully. However, right now their success is reportedly limited, and there were no significant changes to the front line in the Luhansk region. Some sources have been reporting lately that the Ukrainians are losing control over the forest near Kreminna. But today Ukrainian soldiers released a video where they caught and completely destroyed a Russian patrol. I will not show how they killed them, but judging by the video description, the attack was conducted somewhere to the south of Kreminna. Some fights were also reported in Bayraktar. A few days ago, the Russians tried to advance on Ukrainian positions here to push them out of Bayraktar and consequently take half of the forest. At first they achieved some success and established control over the northern part of Bayraktar. This theoretically secured the southern part of the forest, which is why a lot of claims started suggesting that the Russians were advancing from Crimea. But today, the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack and successfully pushed the Russians to their initial positions. Overall, the Ukrainians have regained the initiative in this region once again and are the ones who conduct most attacks, while the Russians are either in pure defense or active defense. Lastly, a series of explosions were reported in Crimea. The targets of these attacks became Jenko and Feodosia. In-video evidence suggests that the attack was conducted by drones. Now, Jenko is 150 kilometers away from the nearest Ukrainian positions, while Feodosia is more than 250 kilometers away. Some sources say that these drones are Ukrainian-made. Interestingly, together with the reports about these explosions, some articles were published where it was said that Ukrainian drone technology is developing at a rapid pace. And after the war, Ukraine might as well become the biggest producer of drones in the world. Hopefully this comes true.